the Nydor-Seven star system drowned in a suffocating, absolute silence. It was not merely the natural vacuum of space, but a profound, unnatural stillness that could only follow 6 hours of relentless, catastrophic violence. The battle was over. The scattered, burning wreckage of the Outer Axis coalition drifted in slow, mournful orbits around the inhabited moon of Cyllene, painting a grim portrait of total defeat. Smashed dreadnoughts and gutted frigates tumbled end over end, their dying fusion drives flickering like crushed fireflies against the infinite dark. Debris fields formed temporary, jagged rings around the moon, a monument to a defense that had broken completely. Aboard the heavy cruiser, Glass Anthem, the wounded flagship of the shattered coalition, Commander Vane Talrin stood perfectly still. The bridge was bathed in the sickly, stuttering glow of emergency crimson lighting. The air tasted of copper, ozone, and the distinct, acrid smoke of melting polymer circuits. Vane kept his focus locked on the massive primary tactical display. Though the crystalline surface of the screen was spiderwebbed with deep fractures from a proximity detonation, the tactical readouts were a parade of failures. Of the proud defense fleet that had assembled just hours ago, the numbers had plummeted to a catastrophic low. The counter showed exactly 8 ships remaining that still possessed the structural integrity and power reserves to return fire. 8 battered husks standing between an overwhelming armada and the fragile world below. That world was Cyllene. Beneath its swirling, pale gray cloud cover lay a vital strategic colony, a home to hundreds of thousands of civilian souls huddled in subterranean habitats. It was a prize of immense value, harboring a deep mantle geothermal power station capable of fueling a sector-wide war machine. More critically, tethered in low orbit above its atmosphere, hung the spine ring. It was an ancient, monolithic structure of unknown precursor origin, a colossal ring of dark, inert metal that the colonists had built their society around but had never dared to fully awaken. It hung there now, a silent witness to the slaughter, dwarfing the debris of the human and alien ships that bled out around it. The architects of this slaughter were the hegemony of Kairos. Their fleet held formation with terrifying, mathematical precision, a wall of jagged, predatory silhouettes blotting out the distant stars. At the helm of this invincible armada was War Master Drive Core. When the transmission from the Kairos flagship pierced the static of the Glass Anthem, there was no triumphant howling, no arrogant mockery, no sneering conqueror reveling in his victory. That was what made it so chilling. Drive Core opened the broad-spectrum surrender channel with the dispassionate, flat tone of a clerk finalizing a mundane administrative procedure. His voice was a cold synthetic baritone that echoed through the ruined bridge, demanding absolute capitulation. The terms were not negotiations. Drive granted Vane exactly 30 minutes to power down all remaining weapons, lower the planetary shielding, and transmit the unconditional surrender codes. If the counter reached 0 without compliance, the hegemony would commence full planetary occupation. Drive used the phrase population restructuring, a sanitized bureaucratic euphemism under Kairos martial law that meant systemic enslavement, forced labor camps, and the systematic execution of anyone deemed a political or physical liability. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavier than the failing gravity plating beneath their boots. The atmosphere on the command deck of the Glass Anthem settled into a state like cooling forge iron, heavy, rigid, and trapped. Officers moved with the sluggish, numb motions of the condemned. At the portside sensor station, Leo Marr, the youngest officer on the bridge, stared into his scopes. Sweat tracked through the soot on his pale face. His hands trembled over the haptic interfaces as he desperately scoured the deep space telemetry, looking for a rupture in the dark, a friendly transponder, an allied fleet. He was digging through the cosmic static for a miracle that he fundamentally knew did not exist. The coalition was stretched too thin. The core worlds were too far. No one was coming. Vane rested his gloved hands on the edge of the holotable, feeling the subtle vibrations of the ship's failing life support. He was a veteran of a dozen campaigns, and he possessed the clarity to accept the absolute truth of their situation. He had been outmaneuvered and outgunned. The coalition had lost on every conceivable metric. They were annihilated in sheer numbers, overwhelmed by superior firepower, starved by cut supply lines, and finally, thoroughly broken in spirit. The cold logic of tactical warfare dictated an immediate surrender to save civilian lives. Yet, Vane knew the reality of Kairos' occupation. Surrender did not mean survival. It merely changed the method of their destruction. The only tangible currency he had left to spend was time. If he held the line, if he forced the Kairos to prepare for a boarding action or an orbital bombardment, he could buy the colony beneath the moon a few more precious minutes to seal the deepest blast doors and arm the civilian militias. It was a pathetic, final act of defiance, but it was all he had. Far below the silent graveyard of the orbital battlefield, the reality of the defeat was settling into the crust of Cyllene. Inside the sprawling civilian bunkers carved deep into the moon's mantle, the panic had given way to a terrifying, claustrophobic waiting game. The planetary governors had ordered the power grid severed to conserve energy for life support. In the vast, cavernous shelters, the emergency backup lights had been sequentially shut down, leaving only a weak, spectral amber glow to illuminate the faces of hundreds of thousands of terrified people. The silence down here was different from the silence of space. It was heavy, shared, and thick with the sound of collective breathing. The only intrusion from the outside world came in the form of deep, resonating shudders that shook the bedrock. It was the horrific sound of their own defensive fleet, the shattered armor plating and sheared engine cowlings of coalition cruisers, burning up as they hit the upper atmosphere, raining down as metallic meteors upon the surface. Every tremor was a reminder that their shield was gone. Aboard the flagship, the oppressive countdown timer projected above the main viewer ticked backward relentlessly. 29 minutes. 28. The bridge crew worked in funereal silence, rerouting whatever scraps of power they could find to the deflector screens, preparing for a final stand that would last less than a minute once the Kairos opened fire. The digital counter ticked down to exactly 24 minutes. At the sensor station, Leomar's console emitted a sharp, high-pitched harmonic chime. The sound was so completely alien to the grim symphony of alarms and failing systems that half the bridge crew physically flinched. Leo practically slammed his face into the viewing hood, his fingers flying across the diagnostic relays, convinced his damaged equipment was generating phantom data from the electromagnetic feedback of the wreckage. "Commander," Leo said, his voice cracking, a sudden, desperate spike of adrenaline shattering the gloom of the bridge. "Massive spatial displacement detected. Gravimetric shear at the system's outer edge." Vane turned slowly, his boots heavy on the deck plates. "A Kairos flanking maneuver. They don't need it. We are already dead." "No, sir," Leo breathed, his eyes wide as he transferred the raw telemetry to the main cracked display. The data streams cascaded down the fractured glass. "It is an FTL rupture. A massive one." "Right at the heliopause. But the trajectory makes no sense. It is not on any of the emergency relief vectors we transmitted. It is coming from the deep void, outside any established shipping lane." Vane stared at the blooming energy signature on the screen. The energy spike was colossal, tearing through the fabric of normal space with violent, uncalculated force. The coalition had begged the core worlds for aid. They had sent distress drones in every conceivable direction. But the region of space this rupture was emerging from was supposed to be completely dead. There were no Allied bases out there. There were no patrol fleets. There was absolutely nothing. "Identify," Vane ordered, his voice suddenly sharp. The fog of defeat parting just a fraction as the sheer impossibility of the situation demanded his attention. "Trying to cut through the radiation bloom," Leo replied frantically, his hands dancing across the terminal. The displacement wave is huge. Whoever it is, they did not bleed off their momentum before transitioning. They are coming in hot! The bridge of the glass anthem fell silent once more. But the quality of the silence had changed entirely. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of an execution chamber. It was the breathless, agonizing tension of the unknown. As the digital timer ticked past 24 minutes, the dark space at the edge of the Nydor-Seven system began to warp and tear, heralding the arrival of an anomaly that belonged nowhere on the grim tactical maps of Commander Vane Talrin. "Commander!" Leo Mar's voice cut through the heavy, stale air of the bridge, completely stripped of its previous despair and replaced by a sharp, clinical disbelief. His hands flew across the haptic interface, struggling to isolate the sudden surge of data flooding his station. "I have 39 distinct contacts. They just tore out of faster-than-light transit right along the edge of the Nydor-Seven natural gravity shoals." Vane stepped closer to the fractured tactical display, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. The Nydor-Seven shoals were a notoriously unstable region of space, a natural minefield of fluctuating gravitational eddies that could crush a frigate like a tin can. Standard naval doctrine dictated a wide berth and a heavily decelerated approach. The telemetry Leo was projecting was nothing short of absurd. "Velocity," Vane demanded, his eyes tracking the tight cluster of new icons blooming on the edge of the sensor range. "That is the problem, sir," Leo replied, his eyes wide, reflecting the harsh light of the console. "They are not decelerating. I am reading 0 braking thrust. They skip the standard transition slowdown entirely. They are maintaining a brutally tight, aggressive formation at speeds that should theoretically tear their own hulls apart in that gravity shear." The command board struggled to process the anomalous radiation wash pouring from the new arrivals. The identification friend or foe transponders were heavily masked by thick Cherenkov interference, a byproduct of an incredibly reckless, overcharged faster-than-light jump. The decryption algorithms chewed through the static, slowly assembling the fragmented digital signatures. A string of characters resolved on the main display, flashing in stark white against the crimson tactical map. The entire command deck frozen in a collective state of shock. The designation read, Human Vanguard Expeditionary Group. Vane felt a cold spike of pure bewilderment pierce through his exhaustion. He stared at the designation, his strategic mind struggling to process the variable. The Sol system and its sprawling territories were light years outside the current theater of operations. Earth was not on any emergency protocol list the Coalition possessed. They had never formally allied with the Terran systems, nor had any distress drone been pointed in their direction. Humanity was widely considered a neutral, fiercely independent, and utterly uninvolved faction in this sector's politics. There was absolutely no logistical, political, or tactical reason for them to be here. On the still open transmission channel, the supreme, suffocating confidence of the Kairos commander abruptly shattered. War Master Drave Kor, who had been dictating his terms of absolute capitulation just moments prior, stopped right in the middle of a syllable. The terrifyingly placid expression on the alien warlord's face cracked, revealing a sudden, rigid tension. For the very first time since the slaughter had begun, Drave shifted his gaze away from Vane's feed. He turned his massive, heavily armored head toward an unseen subordinate, standing off-screen on his own bridge. "Who called them?" Drave demanded. His synthetic translator struggled and failed to mask the sudden, sharp edge of genuine alarm echoing in his native, guttural tongue. It was a question asked not out of curiosity, but out of a sudden realization that the parameters of his perfect victory had just been violently altered. Before the Kairos fleet could scramble their electronic warfare suites to jam the sector, a system-wide broadcast overrode every active channel. It bypassed the hegemony's sophisticated encryption nets with a brutal, mathematical efficiency that spoke of highly advanced intrusion protocols. The voice that filled the bridge and every other surviving receiver in the system was human. It was female, and it was completely devoid of any theatrical bravado or righteous fury. It was the icy, measured, and hyper-focused tone of someone who had calculated the exact, gruesome cost of the coming violence and had already accepted it. "This is Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale, commanding the Vanguard Expeditionary Group," the voice echoed, crisp and clear, despite the ambient radiation of the battlefield. 13 days ago, we detected a dead pulse harmonic. It was heavily encrypted, buried deep within the background static of the Cyllene planetary weather network. She paused, allowing the cold fact to settle over the millions of listeners across the system. "No one requested our presence through official protocol," Tamsin continued, her words cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "But someone down there tried very hard to say that there are still people alive." War Master Dravekor quickly recovered his composure, his face twisting back into a mask of engineered disdain and supreme arrogance. He keyed his broad-spectrum response, ensuring the entire system could hear his mockery, aiming to crush this new, fragile hope before it could take root. "You bring wreckage to a graveyard, human," Drive sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. His tactical sensors had clearly finished scanning the new arrivals, stripping away the mystery of their sudden appearance. "You field 39 vessels. My scopes show structural fractures across your entire line. Half of your ships are already trailing ionized plasma and venting atmosphere from your reckless, forced transit. You bring broken, exhausted ships to face my 58 pristine warships. You have chosen a very long journey just to die." Drev was tactically correct. The Vanguard fleet looked terrible on the sensors. They were running hot, their thermal profiles blazing dangerously near catastrophic meltdown levels. They carried the deep, internal scarring of a fleet that had pushed its drives far past any recommended safety limits for 13 uninterrupted days. Against 58 fully shielded, heavily armed, and perfectly organized Karos warships, 39 damaged human vessels amounted to little more than a suicide pact. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale did not offer a rebuttal. She did not engage in the traditional posturing of naval commanders or defend her tactical position. The system-wide communication channel simply clicked shut with a deafening, absolute finality. Instantly, the entire human formation went perfectly dark. They initiated absolute emission control, a level of extreme radio silence that shut down all active radar, LiDAR, and communication arrays. They rendered themselves virtually invisible to anything but raw, optical tracking, and passive mass detectors. On Vane's cracked tactical screen, the 39 human contacts surged forward. They defied every established doctrine of naval engagement. They did not fan out into a defensive perimeter to assess the threat. They did not deploy skirmishers to test the Karos lines. They drove their massive main engines to catastrophic output levels, condensing their formation into a singular, tightly packed spearhead of dark, silent metal. They were sacrificing all evasive capability for pure, concentrated mass and velocity, hurling themselves directly into the dense center of the massive Karos armada like a thrown javelin. A profound, chilling realization washed over Vane, freezing the blood in his veins. As he watched the human vanguard accelerate toward what seemed like certain, instantaneous death, he understood the true, terrifying nature of their arrival. It was not the suddenness of their appearance that made his skin crawl, nor was it the severe numerical disadvantage they faced. It was the undeniable manner of their assault. They had not come as a standard rescue fleet, cautiously attempting to salvage a lost tactical situation. They were not here to negotiate a ceasefire, to establish a perimeter, or to buy time for an evacuation. They were flying with the chilling, absolute certainty of a decision that had been finalized the moment they received that pulse. They were not arriving to fight a battle. They were a weapon that had been fired 13 days ago, and they were simply reaching their target. The hegemony Vanguard maintained a massive, interlocking fan formation. It was a flawless, mathematically perfect killing web constructed of heavy warships. Their naval doctrine relied entirely on overlapping fields of concentrated fire. Any deep strike penetration attempting to breach that perimeter should have been vaporized at extreme range. Converging plasma streams were meticulously calculated to crush single points of entry long before they ever posed a physical threat to the main fleet. But the human Vanguard completely refused to fan out. They stubbornly refused to present a broad, predictable target for the enemy gunners. Instead of safely matching the defensive spread of the alien armada, they aggressively collapsed inward. They became a localized, terrifying singularity of solid mass, flying wingtip to wingtip with zero margin for navigational error. Then, they executed a maneuver that fundamentally defied every known law of standard naval combat. They did not fire lateral maneuvering thrusters to alter their approach vector. They fired heavy, physical mass drivers, gigantic, hardened carbon inertial anchors launched from their forward pneumatic tubes with concussive force. These thick, physical tethers slammed directly into the drifting, shattered carcasses of the recently destroyed coalition ships. The human pilots did not attempt to dodge the floating debris field that cluttered the battle space. They explicitly weaponized it. They used the dead, heavy hulks of ruined cruisers and shattered dreadnoughts as orbital pivot points. As the high tensile tethers pulled violently taut, the massive human vessels violently whipped around the wreckage. The physical shear strain on their internal bulkheads and structural spines must have been absolutely unimaginable. They changed their attack vectors at extreme, jagged angles that completely ignored conventional astrophysics and safe structural tolerances. The sudden kinetic shifts were brutal, instantaneous, and completely unpredictable to the enemy targeting computers. From the ruined, flickering bridge of the Glass Anthem, Commander Vane Talrin watched this impossible display of piloting. Short, gasping breaths escaped his lungs. The human vessels were not flying through the void in any recognizable sense. They were violently falling through it. They swung like colossal, unhinged pendulums, intentionally releasing their physical anchors at the precise millisecond of maximum lateral velocity. It was a highly controlled, catastrophic freefall. There was no standard naval formation to track. There was no textbook geometry for the Karos to predict. It was a chaotic, predatory tumble through a sprawling graveyard of metal. The hegemony gunners finally reacted to the sheer audacity of the charge. Thousands of automated plasma batteries erupted in a blinding, perfectly synchronized volley. The empty space between the fleets literally boiled. The converging fire slammed heavily into the Vanguard spearhead. 3 human destroyers took the absolute brunt of the initial, devastating wave. Their outer ablative armor sheared off in brilliant, blinding flashes of localized destruction. Thick titanium plating and heavy composite alloys shattered into millions of glowing, molten fragments that scattered across the void. Yet, against all odds, their remaining internal structures held together. The 3 crippled ships bled precious atmosphere and glowing azure reactor coolant directly into the vacuum of space. But they did not lose a single fraction of their forward speed. They did not break off and retreat. The entire human spearhead kept accelerating, seemingly feeding off the kinetic momentum of their own destruction. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale executed her next tactical phase without a single spoken word. Across the entire human line, active reflection signatures completely vanished from the scopes. They forcefully dumped their massive thermal blooms into internal, supercooled heat sinks, risking catastrophic internal fires to blind the enemy. The visual and sensor profiles of 39 massive warships suddenly blurred into a ghostly, shifting smear of gray static. The hegemony targeting arrays relied heavily on precise thermal emissions and magnetic locks to calculate their firing solutions. At this rapidly closing, point-blank distance, the Karos sensors choked on the sudden, deliberate lack of coherent data. Automated tracking turrets spun wildly on their mounts, firing blind, full spread volleys into the empty space where the Vanguard had been, just a split second prior. The lead human ship violently emerged from the visual static. It was a deeply scarred, brutalist wedge of dark, unpainted metal. The Coalition transponder identified it as the RKV Resolute. It did not attempt to evade the incoming crossfire. It drove its massive bulk directly into a microscopic, highly dangerous gap between two heavy Karas cruisers. The spatial gap was far too narrow for a ship of its displacement. The physics of the pass were mathematically suicidal. Two direct concentrated plasma lances struck the Resolute point blank on its final approach. The horrific energy impacts gouged deep, molten canyons straight down its starboard flank. Entire internal bulkheads collapsed under the extreme thermal shock, venting compartments to the void. But the sheer, unstoppable mass and raw velocity of the human vessel acted like a physical, unstoppable wedge. The kinetic shockwave of its passing violently shoved the two massive enemy cruisers apart. Their overlapping, synchronized energy shields ground together, sparking violently across the spectrum before collapsing completely under the conflicting frequencies. The pristine, previously impenetrable outer defense layer of the hegemony shattered like brittle glass under a massive hammer blow. Vane saw the absolute truth of the terrifying human strategy. It hit him with the blunt force of a physical impact. They were not here to win a prolonged, elegant war of attrition. They knew perfectly well they could not win a sheer exchange of traditional firepower against a superior force. Their primary objective was purely psychological and deeply systemic. They were a violent, jagged wrench thrown straight into the gears of a perfect, flawless machine. Tamsin Vale fully intended to brutally shatter the unified command rhythm of the Karos fleet. She was deliberately destroying their pristine, ordered formation before War Master Dravekor could successfully transition his forces from a state of tactical victory into a methodical, unstoppable extermination protocol. Vane violently slammed his heavily gloved hand onto the main communication console. He forcefully canceled the automated surrender sequence. The grim, red countdown timer died instantly on the shattered screen. "Target the exact human breakthrough vector," Vane roared. His voice cracked with a sudden, violent surge of raw, unadulterated adrenaline. The heavy, suffocating lethargy of defeat completely vanished from his tone. "Bring the main batteries back online right now. Divert all remaining life support. Divert the internal gravity plating. Give me every single joule of reserve energy you can find directly into the forward guns. All 8 remaining ships. Form up tightly on the glass anthem. We follow them straight in." His battered bridge crew stared at him in pure shock for exactly 1 second. Then, their hands flew across their cracked stations in a frenzy of motion. The dim, depressing red emergency lights flared out, instantly replaced by the stark, blinding white illumination of maximum combat readiness. The seemingly dead hulks of the 8 surviving Coalition ships shuddered violently. Their dying engines flared back to life, spitting dirty, unrefined plasma trails as they aggressively aligned their ruined prows with the chaotic, bleeding wake of the human Vanguard. Far below the orbital carnage, within the deep, subterranean darkness of Cyllene, the terrified civilian population slowly looked up. The thick, heavily armored viewing ports of the shallowest protective bunkers showed a rapidly changing sky. The dull, uniform ash of a lost, silent war was suddenly and violently torn apart. Vicious, razor-sharp streaks of blinding, searing light carved deep paths through the upper layers of the atmosphere. They were the massive atmospheric displacement trails of a heavy fleet, burning its way straight through a planetary blockade. The millions of citizens trapped in the dark underground did not know whose ships were painting their ruined sky with such violent fire. They had never heard the name of the human Vanguard. They only knew one impossible, glorious truth as the ground vibrated beneath their feet. The battle had just come back to life. Deep within the armored core of the primary human flagship, the heavy naval vessel Ashen Crown, The chaotic roar of the Void War felt like a distant, muffled tremor. The bridge was a cavernous, hyper-cooled amphitheater of matte black composite and muted amber holographics. Here, there was no panic. There was only the ruthless, calculated processing of violence. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale stood perfectly centered within the primary tactical sphere, bathed in the soft, shifting light of 1,000 converging data streams. Her expression was carved from glacial ice, while the rest of the surviving coalition forces outside were scrambling to rally behind her sudden breakthrough. Tamsin's focus had already moved past the immediate slaughter. She keyed a localized command frequency, isolating the audio feed to her senior command staff. "The coalition commander out there thinks we just threw away half our operational capacity to pull his boots out of the fire," Tamsin stated, her voice even and devoid of self-congratulation. "Let him believe that. It keeps his remaining cannons pointed at the hegemony. But let us be absolutely clear about our parameters. Winning a standard void skirmish against this armada is merely a secondary, conditional objective. Our primary target is the structure currently anchored in the low orbit of the moon." She gestured toward the massive holographic projection floating in the center of the room. It zoomed in on the spine ring, the colossal, inert halo of dark metal that hung above the cloudy atmosphere. Dr. Senna Voss, the chief science officer of the expeditionary group, stepped into the light of the projection. Her cybernetic ocular implants whirred faintly as she adjusted the spectral analysis of the massive structure. She did not possess the rigid posture of a naval officer. Her demeanor was that of a researcher staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. "The colonists down there treat it like a glorified orbital shipping tether," Voss began, bringing up a cascade of deep scan schematics that looked nothing like standard human or coalition engineering. "They are completely oblivious to its actual architecture. The spine ring is not a docking station. It is a highly advanced piece of precursor technology. Specifically, it is a macro-atmospheric resonator." Voss highlighted a dense, heavily shielded section of the ring's inner circumference. "If the hegemony of Kairos manages to capture that structure intact and successfully interfaces with its phase control core, this military engagement becomes entirely irrelevant. The alien warlord will not need to launch a single ground invasion troop or fire an orbital bombardment to subdue the population. The ring can manipulate the barometric pressure and electromagnetic fields of the entire moon. They can turn the atmosphere into a planetary-scale weather prison." The implications hung heavily in the chilled air of the command deck. Voss explained that by weaponizing the climate, the hegemony could summon perpetual, hurricane-force squalls to flatten agricultural domes, generate localized electromagnetic storms to permanently fry the subterranean power grids, and create pressure zones that would slowly suffocate the civilian bunkers. They could force an absolute, unconditional surrender through slow, agonizing environmental attrition without ever committing a mass execution that could spark a sector-wide uprising. Tamsin turned to face her officers, her gaze cutting through the holographic dust. 13 days ago, our deep space listening posts did not intercept a military distress beacon. We caught a ghost in the machine. She activated a playback file. It was not a chaotic scream for help or a burst of encrypted tactical telemetry. It was a piece of music. It was a haunting, melancholic loop of synthetic string instruments, playing a heavy, mournful melody that repeated flawlessly. A civilian colonial engineer buried that audio sample deep within the background noise of the moon's automated environmental sensor network, Tamsin explained, the faintest trace of solemn respect coloring her tone. It was a dead man's switch, a digital message in a bottle cast into the dark. That engineer realized the hegemony was not just scanning military installations, but aggressively probing the precursor architecture. That music was a final, desperate attempt to tell the universe that a cage was being built. Tamsin rested her hands on the cold metal of the tactical table. I did not order a forced march transit across open space to save a lost battle. We are here to protect the fundamental right of those people not to have their own sky turned into their executioner. We are here to ensure the future of that colony is not rewritten by ancient, stolen technology. At the navigation console, Commander Rhea Mercer cross-referenced the orbital drift of the ring with the dense clusters of enemy warships. She traced a glowing green path through the chaotic Red Sea of the Hegemony Formation. "Admiral, I have isolated a short approach corridor that intersects with the ring's primary access pylon," Mercer reported, her voice tight with strain. "But it is heavily contested. It sits directly behind the thickest concentration of hegemony thermal fire. We will have to thread the needle through their heaviest dreadnoughts to reach it." While the bridge crew calculated the impossible approach vector, a very different kind of preparation was occurring deep within the armored belly of the Ashen Crown. In the hyper-pressurized launch bays, Sergeant Juno Pike slammed a fresh magnetic slug magazine into her heavy assault rifle. Around her, dozens of heavily armored boarding specialists were performing their final gear checks in grim, focused silence. They were not strapping into standard orbital drop pods. They were loading into specialized, jagged breaching torpedoes designed to physically bore through solid warship hulls. Pike activated her helmet's internal comms, broadcasting to the assault teams. "Listen closely. Vanguard. Standard boarding doctrine is completely out the airlock for this run. If you breach an enemy vessel and find a clear path to their central command deck, you turn around and walk the other way. We are not hunting for their captains. We are hunting for their nervous system." The pre-mission intelligence had revealed a terrifying anomaly regarding the hegemony's flawless combat coordination. They did not rely on standard, light-speed communication relays or rigid hierarchical command structures to maintain their perfect formations. The Kairos fleet was linked by something far more insidious. It was a heavily classified, semi-biological tactical prediction network known as the Measure Throne. It was a synthetic hive mind engine that processed the battlefield telemetry of every single ship simultaneously. However, this system required massive, physical synchronization nodes grotesque, biomechanical routing clusters grafted deep within the lower engineering decks of their heavy cruisers. The hegemony fights like a single, unified organism because those nodes synchronize their predictive algorithms, Pike explained, locking her helmet into place. "Our objective is to sever those nerves. You locate the biological routing clusters near their reactor housings, and you burn them to ash. You do not engage in prolonged firefights. You cut the cord and you move to the next target." The horrifying reality of the situation was crystal clear to every human soldier locking themselves into a breaching tube. If they failed to blind the enemy fleet, if they could not sever those synchronization nodes before the alien warlord laid his hands on the spine ring, the consequences would be apocalyptic. If the predictive, semi-organic intelligence of the Measure Throne was successfully linked directly into the precursor weather control architecture, Cyllene would not just fall under military occupation. The hegemony would be able to foresee every localized rebellion, every smuggled ration, and every whispered conspiracy, and answer it instantly with a devastating, targeted atmospheric strike. The colony would be locked into a form of permanent, inescapable subjugation, far more absolute, and infinitely worse than simply losing a war of fire and metal. The human destroyers that had violently shattered the initial defensive perimeter did not press their advantage by chasing the heaviest hegemony dreadnoughts. Instead, they executed a maneuver of terrifying intimacy. They slammed their thrusters into reverse, bleeding kinetic energy just long enough to grind alongside the massive Kairos artillery cruisers. Colossal magnetic clamps, usually reserved for deep space salvage operations, fired from the human hulls. The brutal impact of metal kissing metal echoed through the void as the destroyers physically bolted themselves to the flanks of the enemy warships, coordinating the localized fire zones. Inside the breaching torpedoes, the violent deceleration rattled teeth and bruised ribs. Sergeant Juno Pike felt the jarring thud as her pod drilled directly into the thick composite armor of a hegemony cruiser. The heavy entry hatch blew outward in a shower of white-hot sparks. Pike and her squad poured into the alien vessel. They carried zero schematic blueprints. They possessed absolutely no detailed biological data on the internal security forces. They were operating completely blind in a hostile labyrinth. Pike pressed her gauntlet against the nearest bulkhead. She closed her eyes, tuning out the blaring alien klaxons. She felt for the deep, rhythmic vibrations of the ship. She traced the microscopic tremors of high-voltage conduits and the heavy thrum of the primary coolant lines. "The synchronization node draws massive power," Pike ordered, her voice cutting through the squad comms. "Follow the heaviest vibration. Move." They advanced rapidly down the angular, purple-lit corridors. When a heavily armed Kara security detachment locked down a primary intersection ahead of them, establishing an impenetrable kill zone of overlapping plasma fire, Pike did not order her squad to dig in. They did not engage in a prolonged, bloody war of attrition. They immediately retreated down a secondary hall, slapped heavy shape charges onto a maintenance bulkhead, and blew a jagged hole directly into a vertical service shaft. They climbed like heavily armed insects, bypassing the choke point entirely. They dropped from the ceiling grates 2 sectors away, leaving the enemy forces guarding an empty corridor. They moved like a localized infection, always striking from the exact angle the hegemony was completely unprepared to defend. Outside, in the brutal vacuum, Commander Rhea Mercer was orchestrating a chaotic ballet of survival. She refused to let the Vanguard ships present clean profiles. Whenever a Karos targeting array attempted to lock onto a human vessel, Mercer ordered her pilots to physically drag the floating carcasses of destroyed coalition ships into the line of fire. They used the massive, dead husks as dynamic, ablative shields. They forced the hegemony gunners into suboptimal firing angles, making them waste precious plasma charges, obliterating already dead metal. Aboard the Glass Anthem, Commander Vane Talrin watched the tactical plot with mounting disbelief. Just moments ago, his surviving fleet was utterly obsolete. Now, the chaotic, jagged maneuvers of the Vanguard were creating highly specific, hyper-localized blind spots within the hegemony grid. The human ships were violently stirring the battle space, dragging the heavy Karos cruisers out of alignment. Vane realized a profound truth. With only 8 battered ships remaining, his coalition forces suddenly held immense tactical value. The humans were manufacturing chaos in the exact locations necessary to make every single Allied shot matter. War Master Drave Kor recognized the spreading infection within his ranks. In a desperate bid to re-establish total control, he issued a fleet-wide command to tighten the central formation. He sought to pull every functional warship into a dense, impenetrable defensive sphere around his colossal flagship, the Night Citadel. It was a classic, heavy-handed doctrine designed to crush any infiltration through sheer proximity and overlapping point defense networks. But that massive centralization order possessed a fatal flaw, and the youngest officer on the coalition bridge caught it. "Commander!" Leomar shouted, his fingers flying across the sensor feeds. "I am reading a severe data propagation delay. It is not standard communication jamming." Leo brought up a microscopic view of the hegemony tactical web. Every time Sergeant Pike or one of the other human boarding parties successfully incinerated a biomechanical synchronization node deep inside a cruiser, a massive localized data blackout occurred. "The Karos predictive network is experiencing physical lag," Leo explained, his voice trembling with the magnitude of the discovery. "When a ship loses its node, it stops feeding telemetry to the measure throne. The central intelligence suddenly has a blank spot. The entire fleet hesitates while the system attempts to recalculate the missing variable. The humans are not trying to destroy the enemy ships outright. They are systematically inducing seizures in the fleet's central nervous system." Drav's order to pull the fleet inward only amplified the problem. The outer rim vessels, suddenly blind and disconnected from the predictive hive mind, reacted sluggishly to the command. They drifted out of phase, their thruster burns delayed by crucial seconds. Vane Talrin saw the opportunity and decided to wager the final, absolute remnants of his life and his fleet. "Helm, push us forward," Vane ordered, stepping right up to the cracked tactical display. "Take us past the minimum safe distance. Bring all 8 ships right into the teeth of the enemy formation." His navigation officer looked up, stunned. Moving that close to the Kairos heavy cruisers was historically a death sentence. "Do it," Vane commanded. "Target only the vessels that have fallen out of synchronization, the ones lagging behind the formation shift. Fire everything we have into those specific blind spots. We are going to rip this wound wide open." The Glass Anthem and her 7 battered sisters surged forward, their crippled engines screaming. They plunged into the chaotic, swirling debris field, sliding right alongside the violently maneuvering human warships. Vane ordered his gunners to unleash a relentless barrage of heavy kinetic rounds and laser fire. They did not aim for the heavily shielded prows. They aimed for the exposed flanks of the sluggish, desynchronized Kairos cruisers. For the very first time in the entire grueling engagement, the hegemony of Kairos misfired. A massive Kairos dreadnought, its predictive node severed by a human boarding team, failed to anticipate the sudden aggressive push from the coalition ships. It fired a full, devastating broadside, directly into the space where the Glass Anthem should have been. But Vane had already pushed his ship past the firing arc. The hegemony formation was actively shooting out of rhythm. Their flawless, mathematical death machine was visibly staggering, choking on its own disrupted reflexes. Watching the towering alien warships falter, Vane finally understood the true nature of the human vanguard. He had spent his entire military career believing that victory went to the side that could absorb the most damage or project the most overwhelming firepower. He thought the humans were simply tougher, or perhaps more reckless. He was wrong. The humans were not merely absorbing the blows. They were actively teaching the entire battlefield how to violently reject a foregone conclusion. They were demonstrating, through sheer, bloody ingenuity and raw mechanical grit, how to grab the inevitable by the throat and force it to choke. The momentum of the Vanguard assault had felt undeniably real. A jagged surge of human defiance violently unmaking the perfect alien war machine. The hegemony lines were buckling, their predictive reflexes shattered. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, the surviving defenders of the coalition believed the tide had fundamentally turned. They had touched the very edge of an impossible resurrection. Then, the void itself seemed to curdle and tear open. From the absolute pitch-black acoustic shadow of the outermost planetary debris belt, a region entirely devoid of active sensor returns since before the battle began, new shapes began to bleed into the physical universe. They did not arrive via faster-than-light transit. They did not drop in from a high orbital plane. They simply surfaced from the dark, shedding their active phase cloaks like deep-sea leviathans rising from crushing depths. 12. Hegemony stealth dreadnoughts materialized. They were colossal, angular slabs of hyper-dense composite, built specifically for silent running and overwhelming ambush operations. They had been waiting in the dark zone the entire time, their reactors running entirely cold, perfectly hidden while the coalition fleet was systematically butchered. They did not waste a single second assuming standard tactical formations. The moment their phase armor dropped, their heavy plasma lances were already fully charged and aligned. They opened fire from an extreme flanking position, unleashing a devastating, synchronized barrage directly into the exposed flank of the human spearhead. The resulting destruction was absolute and instantaneous. The heavy, kinetic shielding of the Vanguard vessels, angled primarily forward to endure the frontal assault, was completely bypassed. In a span of fewer than 4 minutes, 4 human destroyers were methodically vivisected. Thick composite armor flashed into blinding vapor. Internal magazines detonated in horrific, silent blooms of blue and white fire. The primary human attack vector, the unstoppable wedge that had cracked the enemy armada wide open, was violently severed right down the middle. Aboard the ruined bridge of the Glass Anthem, Commander Vane Talrin felt the breath physically leave his lungs. The sudden, catastrophic loss of the 4 human ships registered on the cracked tactical display, not just as fading icons, but as the brutal slamming of a coffin lid. The coalition had been dragged up from the abyss of defeat, handed a brief, blinding flash of hope, only to be shoved violently back down into an even darker, more absolute despair. The broad-spectrum communication channel violently crackled to life. War Master Dravkor did not look rattled anymore. His projected visage was a mask of cold, predatory satisfaction. He bypassed the coalition commanders entirely, addressing his transmission directly to the human flagship. "Did you honestly believe your chaotic geometry was a surprise to me?" Human, Drev's synthetic voice echoed across the system, heavy with manufactured disdain. "Your species is entirely predictable. I knew you would not come for a simple war of attrition. I knew you would set your eyes upon the precursor architecture in low orbit. You desire the spine ring? So, I permitted you to carve your own path toward it. I let you dig your own grave, and now I have simply buried you in it." Drev had orchestrated the entire central collapse. He had willingly sacrificed his own synchronization nodes and allowed the human Vanguard to penetrate the heavy cruiser lines, drawing them deep into a perfectly calculated kill box before snapping the jaws shut with his hidden stealth reserve. On the bridge of the Ashen Crown, the catastrophic damage reports flooded the command sphere, painting the holographic air in flashing crimson warnings. The Vanguard was surrounded, bleeding heavily, and cut off from any lateral escape routes. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale stared at the shifting tactical geometry. Her expression remained completely devoid of panic, maintaining that terrifying, glacial calm. She did not open a channel to trade insults with the alien warlord. She did not attempt to rally the shattered coalition forces. "Hard burn, negative vertical," Tamsin ordered, her voice cutting through the rising alarm klaxons on her own bridge. "Take us down. All remaining Vanguard elements. Execute an immediate atmospheric dive. Plunge directly toward the surface of Cyllene." The command was so fundamentally contradictory to standard space combat doctrine that it defied immediate comprehension. Diving into the gravity well of a moon while under heavy orbital bombardment was tactically synonymous with digging a hole and waiting to be buried. Across the shattered remnants of the Allied fleet, the order manifested on their sensors as a complete and utter rout. The human ships violently angled their thrusters, abandoning the heavy fighting around the orbital ring and burning furiously toward the pale gray cloud cover of the moon below. Furious shouts erupted across the command deck of the Glass Anthem. Coalition officers slammed their fists into their consoles in pure, unadulterated rage. They had committed their final, desperate reserves, throwing their crippled ships into the meat grinder because they believed the humans were leading a genuine counteroffensive. Now, it looked exactly as if the Vanguard had simply recognized the trap, absorbed too many casualties, and chosen a cowardly, panicked flight toward the atmosphere in a desperate bid to crash land and survive. "They used us," Leomar whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and profound betrayal. "They used us as a shield, and now they are running away." Vane Talrin closed his eyes, the heavy silence of defeat returning to crush him. He could not even find the energy to be angry. It was simply the cold, mathematical reality of the universe reasserting itself. The miracle had been a lie, but deep within the command sphere of the retreating human flagship, the reality of the maneuver was vastly different. Commander Rhea Mercer's hands flew across the navigation console, manually calculating the terrifying entry vectors. She was not plotting a desperate escape or a crash landing. She was guiding the Vanguard directly into the thickest, most volatile layer of Cyllene's planetary magnetosphere. "Atmospheric entry in 2 minutes," Mercer reported, the gravitational vibration beginning to rattle the deck plates. Magnetospheric interference is already spiking. The quantum shear down there is massive. That was the true objective. The hegemony relied heavily on their measure throne, a predictive network built on highly precise quantum sensors and flawless telemetric data. By diving deep into the churning, highly ionized magnetic fields of the moon, Tamsin was dragging the enemy into a chaotic environmental fog. Down in the thick atmosphere, the advanced alien sensors would be blinded by natural radiation. Their predictive algorithms would choke on the atmospheric static. Tamsin was actively leveling the playing field by pulling a sophisticated orbital armada into a muddy, blind knife fight in the clouds. To ensure Drevkor swallowed the bait and followed them down into the atmospheric trap, Tamsin executed a masterpiece of strategic deception. "Electronic Warfare Division," Tamsin ordered, gripping the edge of the tactical table as the ashen crown began to shudder violently against the upper atmosphere. "Dump the garbage files. Flood all open frequencies with corrupted internal telemetry. Make it look like our command sync is completely shattered." Instantly, the Vanguard began broadcasting massive packets of fragmented, distressed data. To the alien sensors above, it painted a picture of a human flagship suffering catastrophic internal failures, its command structure panicking, begging its subordinate ships for emergency landing coordinates. It was a flawless simulation of a routed, dying beast desperately trying to find a place to bleed out. The fake retreat worked perfectly. Drevkor, entirely consumed by the arrogance of his trap and the desire to utterly humiliate his new enemy, ordered his stealth dreadnoughts and his heavy cruisers to break orbital formation and pursue the humans into the gravity well. He wanted to crush them against the dirt of the colony they had come to save. But drawing the massive alien fleet down into the atmosphere required a heavy, agonizing toll. To make the panicked flight look completely authentic, and to prevent the hegemony's vanguard from simply overtaking them during the descent, a rearguard was absolutely necessary. Without waiting for a direct order, 3 heavily damaged human frigates at the rear of the fleeing formation deliberately cut their forward thrust. They did not broadcast heroic final speeches or ask for absolution. In a display of cold, mechanical sacrifice, they simply spun on their axes, angling their thickest remaining armor, plating upward to face the pursuing alien dreadnoughts. They became a stationary, heavily armed anvil, deliberately sacrificing themselves to buy the rest of the fleet the precious seconds needed to vanish into the thick, churning clouds below. They absorbed the full, unmitigated wrath of the Kairos pursuit, burning out their weapons and melting their hulls in a ferocious, final stand. The sight of those 3 ships detonating high above the atmosphere pushed the emotional weight of the battle into a realm of agonizing, suffocating pain, solidifying a brutal truth: the humans were not running because they were broken. They were bleeding themselves dry specifically to ensure they would not be defeated. Deep beneath the cracked basalt crust of Cyllene, the air tasted of pulverized stone, old sweat, and the sharp tang of leaking ozone. Mirasol, the senior atmospheric engineer who had cast that desperate, musical plea into the void 13 long days prior, knelt before a massive, archaic terminal. The modern planetary power grid was completely dead, severed by the planetary governors to conserve life support. But the deep mantle acoustic communication lines were not electronic. They were purely physical, a relic from the colony's founding days. She gripped a heavy kinetic hammer and struck a resonant metallic deep pipe protruding from the bedrock. She played a specific, irregular rhythm. 1 heavy strike, a long pause, 3 rapid strikes, a short pause, 2 crushing blows. It was the ancestral storm warning cadence of the colony, a mechanical heartbeat echoing up through the very bones of the moon. Aboard the plummeting ashen crown, plunging through the vicious upper atmosphere, the highly sensitive seismic sensors translated those physical bedrock vibrations back into audio. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale heard the heavy rhythm cutting through the chaotic roar of their atmospheric entry. The connection was miraculously established, bypassing every layer of advanced hegemony signal jamming. "Admiral!" Mira's voice crackled through the heavily encrypted seismic acoustic bridge, synthesized from the raw vibrations of the Earth. "You are flying blindly into a cage. The massive ring above us in orbit is only a receiver, a crown without a body. The actual power, the true planetary anchor, comes from three immense storm-lattice towers buried deep within the crust. The hegemony cannot fully control the sky or the weather unless those three specific spires are awake and synchronized." Mira rapidly painted a grim topographical picture of the subterranean battlefield. Two of the colossal precursor towers were heavily occupied by landed Kairos advance guard units, locked down behind heavy portable barricades. The third tower was dangerously unstable, situated directly beneath a collapsing geothermal rift that groaned and fractured with every single orbital strike raining down from the heavens. Listening to the relayed tactical feed from his own battered flagship, Commander Vane Talrin finally understood the complete, horrifying architecture of War Master Dravecor's cruelty. The alien warlord had deliberately held back his devastating planetary bombardment weapons. He did not want a shattered, dead rock floating in space. Drev needed the immense subterranean power station and the atmospheric resonator perfectly intact. Cyllene was slated to become the grand, terrifying prototype. A fully functional, self-sustaining model of forced colonization and weather-based subjugation to be duplicated across the entire galactic rim. Vane did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately opened a secure channel to his remaining Marine detachments and special operations teams huddled in the drop bays of the 8 surviving coalition ships. "Do not deploy as a standard rescue force," Vane ordered, his voice carrying a completely new, grounded resolve that had been entirely absent an hour ago. "The civilians down there do not need armored saviors swooping in to carry them away. They need triggermen. They know the treacherous terrain of those mines, and they know the ancient machines buried within them. Find the local militia immediately, follow their lead. We are going to help them operate their own world as a weapon." In the suffocating, dust-choked darkness of the subterranean tunnels, a truly unprecedented alliance quickly formed. Hardened human Vanguard shock troopers, bruised and exhausted alien coalition operatives, and soot-covered Cyllene civilian miners locked arms. Guided by Mira's frantic, localized voice over short-range analog radio, the first mixed squad violently breached the massive cavern housing the primary storm lattice tower. It was an absolutely breathtaking sight, a sudden injection of mythic science fantasy into the gritty reality of war. A monolithic obelisk of pale, crystalline metal reached hundreds of meters into the cavern roof, pulsing very faintly with a dormant, cold energy. Elite Kairos sentries patrolled the perimeter, their dark, heavy armor blending seamlessly into the shadows of the cave walls. The Joint Strike Force did not waste precious time on elegant flanking maneuvers. They hit the alien guards with a brutal, localized crossfire of plasma and physical slugs, ruthlessly clearing the base of the spire in under 2 bloody minutes. "The activation sequence is not a digital bypass," Mira urged over the comms, coughing heavily through the thick, swirling rock dust. "It is pure physical alignment. The local technicians call it the tuning fork. You have to manually rotate the 3 massive base rings until the harmonic resonance of the metal perfectly matches the frequency of the surrounding rock." A Cyllene technician, bleeding heavily from a jagged shrapnel, grazed across his forehead, through his body at the massive stone-hewn gears located at the tower's base. 3 heavily armored Vanguard Marines immediately dropped their assault rifles and threw their massive shoulders against the ancient, cold stone alongside him. They strained their combat-augmented muscles to the absolute breaking point, their boots slipping on the bloody rock. With a deafening, grinding roar that shook dust from the ceiling, the massive rings slowly turned and violently locked into place. A colossal, terrifying surge of raw energy ripped upward through the spire. On the surface of the moon, the terrified citizens peering through the narrow viewing slits of their bunkers gasped in pure awe. The permanent, oppressive gray clouds that always blanketed Cyllene were suddenly and violently illuminated from within. Massive, branching bands of brilliant cerulean electricity streaked across the entire visible hemisphere. It did not look like an artificial weapon firing. It looked exactly like the glowing nervous system of a titanic, mythical beast suddenly snapping awake from a 1,000-year slumber. The second tower fell to the Allied forces shortly after. The mixed strike team brilliantly capitalized on the sheer confusion of the enemy forces. The Kairos ground commanders, monitoring the subterranean chaos, firmly believed the fighting was simply a desperate, disorganized civilian evacuation effort. They had completely misread the strategic objective. The hegemony troops thought they were hunting frightened refugees, entirely unaware that the battered survivors of the colony were rapidly assembling a massive, invisible hand to reach up and violently alter the orbital battle above. The human marines and alien operatives stormed the second cavern with ruthless efficiency, their weapons firing in tight, highly disciplined bursts that cut down the defenders before they could raise the alarm. They rapidly secured the room, pushed the massive gears, and aligned the rings, sending another massive, blinding pillar of blue light tearing straight through the planetary cloud cover. The very atmosphere of the moon began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that physically rattled the teeth in the skulls of everyone standing on the surface. But the final objective remained stubbornly out of their reach. Mira's acoustic transmission wavered badly, suddenly thick with a suffocating dread. The third spire. It is located directly beneath the main Kairos temporary occupation zone. They have completely locked down the entire thermal sector. Worse, they have deployed a heavy, localized dampening field over the entrance to the cavern. It violently nullifies all standard kinetic propellant and directed energy weapons. Everything modern just dies the second you step inside that bubble. She paused, the agonizing weight of the moment crushing down on her words. Admiral Vale, listen to me carefully. If that third tower remains dark, the planetary resonance array will not complete its circuit. The spine ring will not invert its polarity. Whatever brilliant, suicidal maneuver you are planning to execute up there in the storm, it will only delay our death by a few hours. It absolutely will not stop it. The reality of the situation was stark and entirely agonizing. The Vanguard had bled themselves nearly dry to reach the atmosphere. The Coalition fleet had sacrificed their final ounce of strength to buy them the chance to dive. The civilians were throwing their fragile bodies against ancient, grinding gears to hand them a loaded weapon. But without that final, heavily fortified pillar shining its light into the sky, the entire beautiful, desperate gambit would inevitably collapse into just another forgotten tragedy in the dark. Sergeant Juno Pike's heavy plasma cutter chewed through the final layer of high-density alloy, protecting the dreadnought's central coordination core. The massive blast doors gave way with a sickening, wet tearing sound rather than the clean, sharp snap of severed metal. Pike kicked the ruined slab inward, her assault rifle raised and sweeping the chamber. What lay beyond the threshold was completely devoid of the sterile, angular architecture found in every other corridor of the hegemony vessel. The air inside the core was suffocatingly humid, reeking of oxidized copper, ozone, and the distinct, coppery scent of amniotic fluid. There were no holographic tactical tables plotting fleet maneuvers. There were no elevated command thrones or standard digital interfaces. Instead, the vast, circular chamber was dominated by towering columns of iridescent, black neural membrane. These fleshy, pulsing pillars stretched from the grated deck plates all the way to the vaulted ceiling, glowing from within with a sickly, bioluminescent violet hue. Suspended within the translucent walls of these organic columns were bodies. Dozens of them hung in silent, unnatural repose. They were perfect, semi-living biological replicas of high-ranking Kairos commanders. Their eyes were rolled entirely back into their skulls, and their heavily armored heads were wired directly into the thick, pulsing central veins of the structure via brutal, metallic shunts. Pike felt a profound chill run down her spine, a primal revulsion that utterly transcended the standard fear of heavy combat. Her squad's combat technician, sweating profusely inside his sealed environmental armor, cautiously stepped forward and connected a diagnostic tether to an exposed, fleshy neuroport at the base of the nearest pillar. The data stream that instantly flooded their helmet visors was not binary code, nor was it standard encrypted military telemetry. It was raw, unfiltered, agonizing synaptic feedback. The horrifying truth struck Pike with the force of a physical blow. The measure thrown was not a highly advanced artificial intelligence. It was a grotesque, biological prediction engine. It actively devoured, preserved, and amalgamated the tactical memories, the localized battlefield trauma, and the strategic brilliance of Kairos warlords spanning across hundreds of generations. This terrifying architecture explained exactly why the enemy armada moved with such flawless, singular purpose. The Kairos ships were not merely receiving centralized orders from a communication relay. The captains of those vessels were literally sharing a finely ground, centuries-old instinct for war. They felt the phantom pain of ancient defeats and the intoxicating rush of countless victories simultaneously, guiding their hands as one unified, monstrous entity. But the nightmare, hidden within the core, did not end with its biological nature. The technician gasped, his heavy gauntlets flying away from his interface terminal as if the console had physically burned him. He forced himself to quickly reconnect, his fingers trembling as he isolated a heavily guarded subroutine buried deep beneath the ocean of stolen memories. It was a final, apocalyptic failsafe. War Master Drave Kor possessed absolutely no intention of leaving his grand prize intact if the battle suddenly turned against his absolute favor. The embedded protocol was uncompromising if his flagship, the Night Citadel, faced imminent capture, critical boarding actions, or catastrophic system failure. Drave would forcibly and remotely overload the phase control core of the orbital structure above Cyllene. The resulting detonation would not merely destroy the precursor artifact. It would violently shatter the massive ring, turning the entire low orbit of the moon into an incurable, hyper-accelerated storm of lethal shrapnel. The sky would become a permanent, raging hurricane of jagged metal, moving at orbital velocities, rendering the colony beneath it completely isolated, trapped, and doomed to a slow, suffocating death in the dark. This single revelation fundamentally altered the entire geometry of the ongoing war. Beating the hegemony fleet in a contest of raw firepower or brilliant maneuvering was no longer sufficient. Humanity, and their battered coalition allies, could not simply win the Void War anymore. They had to actively hijack an ancient, sleeping machine before the enemy decided to set their own trophy on fire, out of pure spite. Pike desperately needed to warn the fleet. She authorized a heavily compressed data packet, transmitting the horrifying truth directly to the Ashen Crown via an ultra-short, highly focused burst channel designed to punch through the thickest jamming fields. Now, the sergeant faced an agonizing, impossible tactical choice. Standard Vanguard doctrine strictly demanded the immediate incineration of the biological node to further cripple the enemy fleet's coordination. However, destroying the columns would permanently sever the only direct, unshielded neural link back to the hegemony flagship. If she kept the grotesque throne alive and pulsing, her tech specialist could actively trace the data pathway straight into the heart of the Night Citadel, potentially providing the human fleet with a crucial, invisible backdoor into Drave's personal command network. She chose the far more dangerous path. She ordered her squad to hold their fire, form a tight defensive perimeter, and protect the pulsing columns at all costs. The exact moment she made that decision, The dreadnought realized foreign entities were actively leeching its ancestral memories. The violet bioluminescence of the pillars violently shifted to a furious, strobing crimson. Heavy, mechanized locking mechanisms slammed shut all around them with deafening finality. The thick bulkheads sealed tight, cutting off any chance of a quick retreat. Pike and her squad were now intentionally trapped deep inside the belly of an enemy warship that was rapidly locking down every single compartment, preparing to purge the human infection with heavy internal security forces. They had to hold the room in a claustrophobic, brutal firefight just to keep the fragile digital threat alive. High above the moon, amidst the chaotic, blinding magnetic storms of the upper atmosphere, the Ashen Crown received the compressed burst transmission. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale read the decrypted telemetry, scrolling across her primary interface. For the very first time since the expeditionary group had violently torn their way into the Nydor-Seven system, an agonizing, prolonged silence stretched across the human command deck. Tamsin stared intently at the holographic projection of the ancient orbital ring. The cold, mechanical certainty that usually defined her command presence fractured just a fraction, revealing the immense, crushing weight of the situation. She fully understood the terrifying reality of their new deadline. Securing a victory through superior tactics, localized electronic warfare, and concentrated plasma fire was simply too slow. The clock had been fundamentally rigged against them. Meanwhile, resting in the silent, perfectly ordered command sanctum of the Night Citadel, War Master Drave Kor sat upon his own physical throne. He watched the chaotic, blurred telemetry of the atmospheric battle plunging into the magnetic fog, his multiple eyes narrowing with cold, calculating malice. He did not yet know that human borders were currently tapped directly into his neural network, but his paranoid, ancient war instincts sensed a subtle, dangerous shift in the tide of the conflict. He decided he would absolutely not allow the unpredictable nature of the universe to dictate the terms of his potential failure. With a slow, deliberate, and chillingly calm motion, his heavy, armored finger authorized the secret command protocol. A silent, digital countdown began to tick away in the deepest, most secure recesses of the hegemony network, initiating the irreversible overload sequence for the spine ring. And far below, buried in the suffocating darkness of the moon's bedrock, despite the desperate, bleeding efforts of the Allied forces and the civilian miners, the third and final precursor tower remained stubbornly, terrifyingly pitch black. The suffocating reality of the ticking clock crushed any remaining hope of a conventional victory. There was simply no time left for a direct, coordinated assault against the overwhelming hegemony armada. Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale stood amidst the flashing crimson warnings of the Ashen Crown, her expression an impenetrable mask of cold calculus. Then, she did the one thing no one in the entire system expected. She opened a system-wide, unencrypted public communication channel and formally requested terms of unconditional surrender for all remaining Coalition and Vanguard forces. Aboard the ruined bridge of the Glass Anthem, Commander Vane Talrin froze. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a pallid mask of profound shock. He stared at the audio feed, utterly paralyzed by the sudden, chilling broadcast. The despair was not contained to the Allied aliens. Across the human flagship, seasoned Vanguard officers exchanged rapid, terrified glances. The legendary iron will of their commander seemed to have finally shattered under the weight of an unwinnable war. They could not distinguish if this was a brilliant, deeply layered strategic feint or the agonizing moment their leader actually broke under the sheer, insurmountable odds. The heavy silence on the Allied communication networks tasted like ash. War Master Drave Kor received the transmission with a dark, rumbling laugh that vibrated through the heavily armored hull of the Night Citadel. He was absolutely convinced that the human command had intercepted his secret self-destruct protocol for the orbital precursor structure. In his arrogant mind, Tamsin Vale had looked at the apocalyptic board, realized she could not save the moon without the hegemony detonating the sky, and rationally chosen submission over total annihilation. Driven by an intoxicating, monstrous ego, Drav accepted the plea for negotiations. However, he demanded a grand, humiliating spectacle. He wanted his absolute supremacy cemented in the minds of the conquered. He issued a fleet-wide command, ordering his victorious warships to break off their localized engagements and consolidate into a massive, heavily condensed guard of honor around his flagship to witness the public subjugation. That singular act of supreme ego was the fatal misstep Tamsin had been counting on. By pulling his massive dreadnoughts and heavy cruisers into a tightly packed, overlapping formation, Drav unwittingly arranged his armada into the exact, dense configuration the spine ring required to violently reflect localized energy back through the planetary magnetosphere. He was building his own funeral pyre, while the public surrender broadcast looped on the open channels, painting a picture of total human defeat. Tamsin executed a rapid, tightly encrypted shadow play. She disseminated 3 highly localized, heavily disguised operational directives through the chaotic background radiation of the magnetic storm. The first layer went to Vane Talrin, ordering the remaining coalition ships to subtly hold the outer perimeter, masking their movements as a disorganized retreat, while secretly preventing any stray hegemony vessels from drifting away from the central cluster. The second layer shot down the biological data tether to Sergeant Juno Pike, commanding her to push the hack directly into the central command interface of the Night Citadel, regardless of the terrifying physical cost to her trapped squad. The final, most desperate order was routed deep underground to Mira Sol. The third storm lattice tower remained completely dead, cut off from the ruined planetary grid. Tamsin instructed the atmospheric engineer to abandon the dead colony generators and violently splice the ancient precursor conduits directly into the heavy power lines of the occupying Karos military encampment above them. They were going to steal the enemy fire to light their own torch, up in the swirling magnetic fog of the high atmosphere. Commander Rhea Mercer finalized a navigational trajectory that bordered on absolute madness. To harness the immense, latent power of the planetary resonance array, the human flagship could not merely fly near the spine ring. It had to become a physical extension of it. Mercer calculated a suicidal flight path that would drive the Ashen Crown directly through a violently unstable space-time distortion field, hugging the inner circumference of the precursor artifact. The gravitational shear within that anomaly would easily tear a standard cruiser to shreds. The objective was to physically ram and magnetically anchor the heavy human dreadnought directly onto the primary resonance axis. At the exact microsecond, the 3 subterranean towers achieved harmonic synchronization. If she was late by a fraction of a heartbeat, the ship would be crushed into molecular dust. Deep within the suffocating thermal sector of Cyllene, Mira and her battered strike team successfully breached the cavern housing the final tower. They had dragged heavy, stolen hegemony power cables through miles of dark, collapsed tunnels, their muscles burning with severe lactic acid buildup. They hastily fused the alien technology to the crystalline base of the obelisk. But as the archaic control pedestal hummed to life, the holographic interface flared with a harsh, denying crimson light. The ancient safety protocols of the machine had awakened. The mechanism explicitly required a dual biological authentication to prevent unilateral catastrophic weather manipulation. It demanded the genetic signature of a native Cyllene citizen and, impossibly, the high-level command biometric of an invading conqueror. Mira stared at the glowing prompt in sheer, unadulterated horror. They had the civilian, but securing a living high-ranking Karos officer in the middle of a desperate subterranean raid was a logistical impossibility. The tower was effectively a sealed vault. Simultaneously, trapped within the biological nightmare of the Dreadnought Coordination Corps, Sergeant Juno Pike finally cracked the ultimate encryption layer. The stolen memories of the Measure Throne parted like a dark sea, granting her direct, unshielded access to the primary command interface of the Night Citadel. She raised her physical interface gauntlet, her hand trembling slightly from the sheer adrenaline, ready to initiate the massive system lockout that would blind the warlord. But as the digital pathway cleared, the visual feed from the enemy flagship resolved on her visor. She expected to see an empty command sanctuary or a panicked crew desperately trying to sever the connection. Instead, the high-resolution image revealed War Master Drive Core standing perfectly still at the far end of his sprawling, metallic throne room. He had not evacuated the chamber. He had not delegated the defense to his internal security subroutines. He was waiting for her. He looked directly into the localized surveillance optic, his multiple eyes piercing through the digital void to meet Juno's terrified gaze. The pulsing biological pillars around her squad suddenly grew cold, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The synchronized, system-wide countdown ticking down to the absolute overload of the spine ring flashed violently across every tactical display. There were less than 7 minutes remaining before the sky detonated into an inescapable cage of orbital shrapnel. Deep beneath the crust of the moon, the third tower remained utterly dark and deadlocked by an impossible biological puzzle. In the upper atmosphere, the Ashen Crown fired its main thrusters, committing itself to a catastrophic, one-way dive into the lethal distortion field of the ancient ring. On the bridge of the Night Citadel, War Master Drive Core offered a slow, terrifyingly serene smile. It was the absolute, chilling expression of a predator who had allowed its prey to exhaust every single desperate trick, only to reveal that every move, every sacrifice, and every hidden gambit had been perfectly, meticulously anticipated from the very beginning. The jaws of the trap had finally snapped shut, and there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The transmission from the alien flagship cut through the heavy static of the battlefield, carrying a tone of absolute, venomous satisfaction. War Master Drive Core believed he had just witnessed the breaking point of the human spirit. He openly mocked Fleet Admiral Tamsin Vale over the open frequency, his synthetic voice echoing across the ruined system. He revealed that he had deliberately accepted her desperate plea for negotiations for one singular, cruel purpose. He wanted to lure the entirety of her battered fleet into a tight, inescapable cluster directly beneath the shadow of the orbital precursor artifact. Drev proudly declared that he knew humanity's ultimate weakness. He believed that, unlike any other warrior race in the galaxy, humans were profoundly rational creatures when faced with absolute extinction. He calculated that when pushed to the absolute brink, they would always choose the logical path of base survival, even if it meant enduring the humiliation of public subjugation. But that cold, mathematical assumption was the exact point where the alien warlord fundamentally misread his enemy. Tamsin Vale never possessed a single intention of surviving in a manner that a tactical algorithm could comfortably predict. As the massive, heavily damaged human flagship plummeted into the violent magnetic shear surrounding the precursor ring, Tamsin did not order her helmsman to establish a stable parking orbit. She ordered maximum thrust. The Ashen Crown screamed through the void, its thick composite armor burning away as it violently slammed its massive prow directly into the primary physical axis of the spine ring. The horrific sound of shearing metal and collapsing bulkheads tore through the ship as heavy magnetic anchors deployed, physically biting into the ancient, cold stone of the structure. Tamsin had literally weaponized her own dreadnought, turning millions of tons of human engineering into the brutal, manual linchpin required to forcefully bridge the broken precursor circuit. Simultaneously, a completely different kind of violence erupted deep inside the biological nightmare of the Kairos Coordination Corps. Sergeant Juno Pike stood amidst the pulsing, fleshy columns of the Measure Throne, staring directly at the digital projection of Drive Core. The warlord was waiting for her to launch a futile, desperate physical attack against his command interface. He expected a traditional duel of kinetic weapons and brute force. Juno completely ignored her rifle. She stepped forward and drove both of her heavily augmented interface gauntlets agonizingly deep into the raw, bioluminescent nervous system of the alien throne. The psychic backlash of 1,000 stolen memories nearly crushed her mind. But she held on with terrifying grit. She did not attempt to shut the system down or assassinate the commander. Instead, she used the massive processing power of the throne to violently bridge a connection with the human Vanguard network. For exactly 1.8 seconds, she forced the supreme flagship of the hegemony to unwittingly share its highest-level authentication rights directly with the human fleet. It was a digital stranglehold that lasted less than 2 heartbeats, but it was all the time the humans needed. That stolen authorization code flashed down the acoustic bedrock tethers directly to the subterranean depths of Cyllene. In the dark, suffocating cavern, the archaic console of the third storm lattice tower suddenly shifted from a harsh, denying crimson to a brilliant, accepting green. It had received the required biometric command of an invading conqueror. Mira Sol, her hands coated in rock dust and blood, slammed her palm onto the heavy ignition relay. The third tower violently awoke. A titanic, resonant shockwave ripped through the mantle of the moon. Deep beneath the crust, all 3 colossal precursor spires finally achieved perfect, harmonic synchronization. The result was instantaneous and absolutely breathtaking. The planetary magnetosphere of Cyllene did not simply energize. It violently erupted upward, solidifying into a colossal, impenetrable wall of blinding cerulean light that pierced the heavy gray clouds. High above, Drav Kor's secret overload sequence hit the spine ring, expecting to shatter the structure into a storm of lethal shrapnel. But the Ashen Crown, acting as a massive grounding wire, channeled the immense, newly awakened power of the 3 terrestrial towers directly into the ring's core. The artifact did not explode. Instead, fueled by the planetary grid, it violently inverted its phase. The colossal ring acted as a cosmic mirror. It captured the flawless, highly advanced predictive targeting algorithms of the densely packed Karos Armada and violently reflected the data straight back into the alien formation. The hegemony fleet was instantly crushed under the weight of its own localized processing. The 12 stealth dreadnoughts, previously hidden in the dark, were violently stripped of their phase cloaks, appearing naked and totally vulnerable against the glaring light of the moon. The Measure Throne, forced to process an infinite loop of its own reflected predictions, completely choked and collapsed into deafening digital static. Every targeting screen, every navigational reflex, and every synchronized tactical maneuver across the alien fleet shattered simultaneously. For the very first time in their long, brutal history of conquest, the hegemony was utterly blind to its own future. Commander Vane Talrin watched the impenetrable alien wall suddenly stagger and break apart into utter chaos. The crushing weight of defeat instantly evaporated from his bridge. He ordered his 8 surviving coalition warships to push their failing reactors past the absolute red line. They surged forward, plunging straight into the massive gaps opening within the disorganized hegemony lines. They did not arrive as glorious, pristine saviors. They slammed into the enemy flanks as the heavy, brutal deadbolt sliding shut on the door that humanity had just violently kicked open. They poured relentless, punishing fire into the drifting alien cruisers, tearing them apart before their localized sensors could even reboot. Aboard the Night Citadel, Drav Kor physically stumbled as the psychic link of his invincible fleet was violently severed in his mind. He stared at the chaotic ruin of his perfect formation. He possessed a singular, fleeting opportunity to engage his emergency faster than light drive and escape the collapsing pocket. But doing so meant permanently abandoning his entire Grand Armada to the slaughter. His massive ego simply could not process the reality of his failure. He hesitated for exactly 1 second, and against the human vanguard, One single moment of hesitation was more than enough to permanently rewrite history. From the bridge of the structurally failing Ashen Crown, Tamsin Vale issued her final, system-wide command. Crash through. Every single remaining human warship that still possessed functional thrusters ignited their drives. They abandoned all defensive postures. They formed a brutal, tight wedge of scarred, bleeding metal and drove straight through the disintegrating center of the Chorus formation. It was a terrifying mirror of their initial, shocking arrival into the system. But this time, it was not an opening gambit to cause confusion. It was the definitive, symbolic, and tactical killing blow. The Vanguard spearhead shattered the spine of the alien armada, leaving nothing but burning, hopelessly disorganized wreckage spinning out into the void. Bereft of their predictive network and facing a completely awakened, hostile planetary defense grid, the surviving hegemony vessels broke. The captains, who could still operate their nav computers, initiated blind, panicked jumps into deep space. The rest simply powered down their weapons and broadcast unconditional surrender codes. The colony of Cyllene was saved, its atmosphere permanently secured beneath the glowing, ancient shield of its own towers. Standing amidst the cheering, weeping crew of his battered cruiser, Vane Talrin finally understood the terrifying truth about humanity. The most dangerous aspect of their species was not their raw kinetic firepower, their thick armor plating, or their brutal tactical brilliance. It was their terrifying willingness to always keep one final, profoundly irrational option hidden deep in their pockets. They were a species entirely willing to operate completely outside the boundaries of what any logical, mathematical model considered acceptable, just to ensure they dragged their enemy into the abyss with them. The echoes of the Battle of Nydor-Seven resonated deeply across the stars. In the immediate aftermath, the deeply shaken Outer Axis Coalition convened an emergency council. They formally granted the human Vanguard Expeditionary Group unprecedented, independent emergency response rights across the entire galactic rim. They recognized that when the darkness became absolute, they needed the monsters who were willing to fight in it. Meanwhile, deep within the heavily fortified intelligence archives of the hegemony military, a quiet, profound change was enacted. The official classification for humanity was permanently altered. They were no longer categorized as an emerging interventionist species. They were reclassified under a new, chilling designation, an unframeable strategic variable. It was a title that served as both a dire warning to future warlords and a silent, bitter admission of total, undeniable defeat. Thank you all so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.